yeah, so feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, and we'll also be using the Q&A feature, but I'll explain all of that down the road. So welcome back, everybody. My name is Adrian. I'm a member of the La Pêche Coalition of the Green New Deal. This is our second last event of the season. So we've been looking forward to this one a lot. Next month's one, the last one, is going to be on the circular economy. And last month was the Earth Day one, where we had a lot of guests, including Martin Lukács, who talked about the history of the Green New Deal with its origins in Canada, with its origins in the LEAP and the NDP convention and grassroots organizing and Naomi Klein's writing. Today, we're going to be talking about the history of public ownership and privatization in Canada and a possible way forward with just transition for all. So I'm just going to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. I'm in Wakefield, Quebec, which is the municipality of La Pêche, which is where our coalition is based. And all this territory is unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, which we acknowledge every event, not just to acknowledge that this land doesn't belong to us, but also to acknowledge the added responsibility that we have as settlers working in the climate justice space, right? Indigenous frontliners around Turtle Island are increasingly coalescing around demands for land back, which this coalition supports. We're going to be talking a lot about ownership today. So we want to kind of begin with that clear framework because land is so central to so much of climate justice and therefore to a just transition. And then the other thing that we wanted to talk about with our kind of center as a framing is not just thinking about justice within the context of the state of Canada, but globally, right? The climate crisis is global, so too are the profits that are driving it. So last month we talked about the people of Anacara in Argentina who are resisting Yamana Gold, which is a Canadian mining company and have been resisting it for years. So we'll probably be talking a lot about decarbonization and electrification today, which is very tied into mining. And the World Bank is predicting that mining could go up by 30 to 800 times in the next 30 years, which obviously has massive implications for Canadian companies who are a source of some of the biggest and most polluting mines in the world. Now, admittedly, those are World Bank numbers, and Starbrand might have something to say about that, and they're not set in stone, and hopefully some of the things that we do as a movement can push those numbers down, but all of that for later, hopefully. With those frameworks in mind, I want to introduce our two incredibly knowledgeable panelists today. So Linda McQuaig, just before the pandemic hit, Linda McQuaig published her most recent book, The Sport and Prey of Capitalists, How the Rich Are Stealing Canada's Public Wealth. If you're interested in the topics that we're talking about today, it's an eye-opening collection of counter-narratives of public ownership in the country, and it coalesces into a really clear message, or at least it did for me. It was published by Dundurn Press, August 2019, which was just before the pandemic. So I guess this is the book tour or the extended book tour. And Linda McQuaig has written 12 books, countless articles and columns. I want to read this section from her bio because I think it's really great. She's a self-described, quote, author, journalist, activist, supporter of workers, oppressed peoples, and animals imprisoned in factory farms, denigrator of Trump, Ford, Kenney, and all others who pose as populists while advancing corporate interests. She also goes on to write, to boast that she has, quote, enraged many of the right, including Conrad Black, who called for her to be horsewhipped, unquote, which I think is as good an endorsement as any. Linda, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Adrian. Can I just add one quick detail to your very nice bio of me? I ran twice for politics for the NDP. And in both situations, I ran against people that ended up becoming finance ministers of Canada, which is kind of interesting. You know, Bill Morneau and Chrystia Freeland. Sadly, I lost to both of them. But it was interesting when I was running against Chrystia Freeland, people used to say, oh, they're so similar. You know, they both wrote books about the rich. But, you know, I think there's quite a difference there because Christia's book was sort of, you know, about how the rich were doing a great job running the world, whereas my book was kind of more in the spirit of the protesters who marched down Wall Street right after the 2008 crash, carrying placards that said, "Jump, you fuckers." So slightly different angles. And I guess that's why she's finance minister and I'm here with you today. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here. And as Adrian was saying, I'm going to talk about privatization, and which is, I would argue, has been the economic dogma of our times and shaped the whole political debate. And it's kind of a hidden subject. It's everywhere. Privatization is everywhere, but we don't really address it that much. What my book attempts to do is to look at Canada and Canadian history through a slightly different lens, through a kind of public lens. Canada has this really impressive history of developing public services, healthcare, education, etc. But and also something we know less about, Canada has this impressive history of developing public enterprises, publicly owned power plants, a national railway, a public broadcaster, a public pharmaceutical company, public banks. In fact, you can sort of make the point that while the US has succeeded in some ways as a private enterprise nation, focused and developing private enterprise, Canada has succeeded in developing public enterprise. And that to a certain extent reflects our different history, geography, and different culture. Typically our development of these public enterprises grew out of our desire for more public control, more democratic control over our economy and our society, out of the notion that some areas of the economy and society and our needs are too important to be left to the marketplace. Like, it's okay to have the marketplace, to carry on much of the business of society, but there's certain areas where public needs are so great that you simply don't want to trust them to the whims of the people that control the private marketplace. And just to give one quick example of this, this actually goes all the way back to the 1890s. But that was the age of water power, when electricity and the ability to transmit, to take water power and transmit it into electricity and have it travel over distances. This was transforming society, this incredibly new power source. And in the US, this new power source was being taken over by what became known as water barons, these enormously powerful corporate interests. But in Canada, it's a different story. And the story really begins in Ontario, where the big water barons wanted to get control, of course, of Niagara Falls, because that was such an important power source. But the people weren't willing to allow that. A popular movement arose of ordinary citizens and small independent business retailers that fought to get control away from the big private interests and to achieve something that they called public power, publicly owned power, so they could ensure that the public would have access to this important new power source and that it would be affordable. And there was an epic battle that took place over a period of about 10 years. And the stunning thing is that even though these enormous, powerful water barons were involved, the public movement, the popular movement, actually won. It's a wonderful story. And as a result, we ended up with Ontario Hydro, which became the first public power company in North America. Of course, later we have Hydro-Quebec as well, but the development of Ontario Hydro was really the key to Ontario's development and competitiveness, and it actually becomes a model for Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal when he develops public power in the U.S., and he explicitly mentions that he modeled it on Ontario Hydro. Anyway, sadly, in recent years, Canadian business and politicians, of course, have embraced the neoliberal agenda, you know, the primacy of markets, the tax cuts for the rich, social spending cuts for everyone else. And a key element of that neoliberal agenda, or Reaganomics, has been privatization. And as a result, we've sold off so much of our valuable public enterprises. Now, I don't have time to go into the details of this because we're restricted to brief comments to open with. Let me just quickly say that in this privatization has meant enormous extra costs for all of us, because what privatization really does, it's about government allowing business to come into so many of our, you know, infrastructure developments and all the kinds of things we need. And this is no bargain for us. It's built into these deals, these so-called P3 deals and public-private partnerships. It's built in that there will be a profit margin in the area of 7 to 9% for the private partners. Well, this just drives up the costs enormously. The Auditor General in Ontario did a study that looked at 74 of these P3s and found that because they brought in the private partner, which was completely unnecessary and wasn't the way it had been done in the past, that cost Ontario, you know, the Ontario government about $8 billion extra. Needless, just money thrown away just to private interests. But, you know, I don't want to, the extra costs are terribly important, but I would also argue that a very important effect of privatization is that we don't just lose money, we lose control. We lose our ability to control key areas of our you know, of our economy and our lives. And just a quick example I'll use to illustrate this. So there's many examples, but this one is just so relevant to the current pandemic crisis. And that is, maybe I'll just introduce it this way. Did you realize that we used to have the world's leading vaccine maker right here in Canada and owned by the people of Canada? This is the story of Connaught Labs. I don't have time to go into the details, but let me just say it's a remarkable story. It's a story of a company, a publicly owned company created by a Toronto doctor out of the principle that he wanted medicine to be available and accessible to all, because it came out of an epidemic of diphtheria where all kinds of Canadian children were dying, and there was a treatment available, but nobody could afford it except the very rich. So he set out to change that, and he did change that in remarkable ways. For 7 decades, Connaught Labs was just an enormous success story. You know, just produced all kinds of treatments and vaccines for typhoid fever, tetanus, meningitis, all kinds of things that had previously been unavailable to people that couldn't afford them. And it was all based on the idea that not to make profit, but to deal with human needs. Connaught actually went on to become you know, contribute to some of the key medical breakthroughs of the 20th century: insulin, penicillin, the polio vaccine. It played an essential role in the global eradication of smallpox. So it's just a remarkable story. And what I'm leading up to is that tragically, it was privatized by the Mulroney government in the 1980s for no good reason other than that the private sector does things better, so-called. And you just have to imagine how different our pandemic experience would have probably been if we'd still had Connaught as a publicly owned company. It was a world leader in vaccines, and it always put Canadians at the front of the line. It also sold its vaccines abroad, but Canadians were top priority. But today, instead of Connaught being owned by the people of Canada and putting human health before profits and developing and producing vaccines with Canadians at the front line, today none of that stuff happens because Connaught doesn't do those things anymore, because now that it's privatized, it's just a mere branch plant of a French pharmaceutical giant. I would like to go on more about that, but I want to quickly link this to where I think Hadrian is going to go with his presentation. And that's that the whole importance of public ownership and public control. I mean, that's clearly something that is always beneficial to the populace, but particularly now when we face the challenge of climate change, probably the greatest challenge we've ever faced. We need more strong public ownership, public control, public leadership. If we're going to bring about a Green New Deal, we need government involved. We need public money. We certainly cannot rely on the private marketplace to get us into a position where we can actually seriously fight climate change. So I would just argue that, I'd like to go on and explain why, how we could afford this fight. People like to say that we can't, but I will leave that to our later commentary. My point is that always it's so useful for the population to have control over the key parts of its economy. That's always been the case. So I would argue, now more than ever, when we face the greatest challenge of all time, we need that public control, that public ownership. We need to act collectively, not rely on the marketplace, because the marketplace will not deliver for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I don't think you'll find a lot of disagreement about that on this panel. And just to give everybody an idea of structure, I'm going to introduce Hadrian. He'll speak. We've got a couple of musical guests, which who we're really excited about. So they'll be interspersed. And then there will be a discussion between Linda and Hadrian, which I will facilitate. And then later, you will facilitate through your questions if you have them. If not, that's also okay. And then we hope to have everybody back home, or I guess off of the internet by 8:30. So our second panelist is a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, who, among other things, puts out the popular federal alternative budget. Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood has written widely, both for policy and for public, on many topics, and is currently focused on a zero carbon economy and a just transition for vulnerable workers and for communities. He most recently authored a roadmap to a Canadian Just Transition Act for the Centre, which came out last month, which is fresh off the press. We're really excited about talking about that. And it's beautiful. If you like policy, take a little look if you're feeling wonkish. He also takes a critical look at the climate aspects of the 2021 federal budget for the Monitor. Hadrian, thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Adrian. And thanks a lot, Linda. That's really great, if disheartening, historical and I guess conceptual context for this conversation. So what I want to talk about just in this little intro is just to use a very kind of recent, tangible example of how this is playing out and how this kind of ideology of the private sector will save us is an obstacle to solving climate change and to taking climate action in the Canadian context. So specifically, I want to talk about the federal budget, which was released a couple months ago, 1 month ago, this spring. And I think it's a really good example of what this federal government has done on climate change, which is to say that on the one hand, they've done more than almost any government in Canadian history. They're making unprecedented historical investments in things like public transit, in clean tech and renewable energy. This particular budget included $41 billion towards a green economy, and that's big money. It covered many areas of the economy. And this budget also builds on net zero legislation that was proposed in the fall, and a new climate plan that was released in December that, for the first time in a national climate plan, actually does put us on a path to meeting our climate targets. So that all sounds really good. And it is fair to say that this is better than, again, any federal government has really done for most of Canadian history. Certainly since the Harper years, it's a big turnaround, and we should celebrate that. But there are some big caveats here. And I want to just go through a couple of the points I just made and explain why there may be, the headlines are not as good as they sound. The first is the scale of the issue. So $41 billion in this budget. A lot of that money was announced previously. Also, most of it is spread out over 5 to 7 years. So what we're actually looking at in this budget is about $6 billion a year in climate spending. It still sounds like a lot, but a lot of leading experts on climate policy are suggesting we should be spending more like 1 to 2% of GDP per year. So that's like, we should be spending more like $20 to $40 billion every year to aggressively transition our economy away from fossil fuels. So in that context, $6 billion sounds like a lot, but we're still coming up short just on the scale of investment. But it's kind of worse than that, because a lot of this money is not really part of a coherent industrial strategy. It's not really a public-led solution to this problem. Most of that money is incentives and subsidies to the private sector to innovate our way out of this problem. There's a real belief inherent here that, you know, if good ideas will flourish and save the day, you know, whatever that looks like, whether it's pulling carbon out of the atmosphere or making our oil extraction projects more efficient. We'll get there, and there's not a coherent plan to make that happen. And there's also the issue here that a lot of that money that looks like climate spending is actually subsidies for the fossil fuel sector. So there's a lot of money in this budget and money that this federal government has promised towards things like carbon capture and storage, which is basically an excuse to keep, for example, coal plants operating much longer than they should be. A lot of the innovation money that they talked about in this budget will be used by oil and gas companies to make their production process a bit more efficient. Great, we should be emitting less methane when we extract oil and gas, but even better would be not extracting any oil and gas. So again, this is money that looks like climate spending that is actually perpetuating the status quo. They're actually investments in a fossil fuel economy. And that's pretty clear, not just in this budget or in the recent climate plan, but in all of this government's communications and actions, that they are addressing, they are talking a big game, addressing a lot of the low-hanging fruit, but not tackling the core issue, which is a dependence on fossil fuels, both on the production side and the consumption side for Canada. That's what we have to do to reduce emissions, is tackle fossil fuel production and fossil fuel consumption. So we're still not there. And then the last big issue here, I mentioned that for the first time, we have a climate plan that puts us on a path to meeting our target. The problem is our target is half as ambitious as it should be at best. We recently enhanced our target to be from 30% to now a 40% reduction in national emissions by 2030 from 2005 levels. But we should be aiming for at least a 60% reduction in that time frame, and arguably more to do our fair. If we're going to account for our fair share of historical emissions, it should be even more than 60% by 2030. So you can see why this can be challenging to talk about, actually, and think about this federal government, because we want to acknowledge that progress is being made, but we really can't let up on emphasizing how inadequate this still is. Especially, it was great that Adrian mentioned at the start the global inequality here. That, I mean, all these criticisms I've just levied are just to bring Canada up to doing its fair share of the global effort. But again, considering how wealthy we are, our historical contribution to this problem, we should be doing a lot more than even that. So the question is, what's the alternative? And I think we'll get to talk about some of that. Adrian did mention the alternative federal budget, which is one project that we lead at the CCPA. We bring together 80 contributors, experts from every kind of policy area from all over the country to put together a fully costed, comprehensive alternative plan. Coming up with a plan is good. That's not the same as getting it implemented, but it's part of the process, and we can talk more about that. And just one piece I wanted to pull out in particular before we go into a bigger conversation was to talk about this idea of a just transition that Adrian mentioned and some of the work I've been doing recently. I think it's worth thinking about the idea of a just transition in two ways. It's probably a familiar concept to most people on this call, but just transition often means different things to different people. So just to quickly pull it apart, the kind of historical and traditional idea of a just transition comes out of the labor movement. And it's quite narrow. It's kind of tied to the idea of workforce adjustment. So we're going to shut down a coal plant. Coal workers are going to lose their jobs. Let's give them some income support. Let's give them some retraining. And they'll be installing solar panels before we know it. So that's like the kind of narrower idea of a just transition. It's an important part. It's especially important to get political buy-in for climate policies. We have upwards of 200,000 people working in the fossil fuel industry today. If we want to make an aggressive shift away from fossil fuel production, we need to make sure those people are supported. But that can't be the whole picture. So there's also an idea of a just transition emerging that's grounded in ideas of social justice, Indigenous reconciliation, inclusion more broadly. And this is more aligned with the idea of a Green New Deal, which, again, I think most people in this call will understand that the Green New Deal is more than just reducing emissions. It's about reimagining our economy to make it more inclusive and sustainable and equitable and across a variety of dimensions. Another way to think about this difference between the reactive transition I mentioned and a more proactive transition into a bigger, greener economy is thinking about, we don't just want to transition out of fossil fuels. That's important, but we also need to transition into something else. And to manage both of those transitions at the same time requires planning. It requires coordination. It requires strategy. And that's why it's so important that we need the public to lead on this issue. And this is something that Linda was saying earlier as well. Like, the market can be efficient, and there are lots of good people working in the private sector. We're not questioning that people in the private sector don't care about the environment. But the private sector is not set up as an institution to address these long-term collective action problems. It just can't do it. So that's why we need the public sector to lead. So I think I'll just leave it at that and look forward to talking more about this.
Thank you, Adrian. A lot of great threads to pick up on there also. So before we go into that discussion, I want to introduce our first musician, and I've got my notes here. Dawn Pritchard is a local singer, songwriter, guitar player. She has 2 albums out. You can find her music at her website, dawnpritchard.ca/music, and we'll link that. And without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Charles-Antoine, who's doing the back end for this webinar, to get that started.
Voila. I'd like to thank Ilsa and Noel for inviting me to come and play music today. They specifically requested that I play this song called Lament of the Caribou, which I wrote from the perspective of a female caribou. And I hope that you like it. And by the way, can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up or something.
I think we can hear you, but I can't see you. I don't know if it's different for anybody else in the comments.
I can see you if that matters.
Yeah,
Great.
I can see you.
Then it's
Okay.
just me.
But you're small in the picture.
I'm small. Okay. Well, I'm going to play anyways. time quickens, what used to pass so slow. 100 years ago, 1,000 of us strong marched to the tree line where our children born. Once was one among so many. Recall the lichen, green, fresh, sweet. Now air is acrid, quickens my heart beat. Skip to the present, fragile as glass. Wild rushing waters fragmented our path. Once was one among so many. Once was one among so many. Once was one among so many. Now I'm one among the few. One among the few. One among the few. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
for this
Donna.
opportunity to play.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I really enjoyed that. And that's from Don's most recent album, Catch Me If You Can. So if you want to feel a lot of other emotions, I recommend you head over to the link and give that a play. So with that, we will go right into the questions. Adrian and Linda, there's a lot of ground to cover. Obviously, you both put a lot of threads out there. There's also a lot going on in the world right now. The first question that I want to ask about is something that progressives rarely talk about, which is victories. I was wondering if you could talk about the IEA report and the big oil developments yesterday, which Bill McKibben called, quote, the most cataclysmic day so far for the fossil fuel industry, unquote.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a big week and an exciting one for climate folks. So just as a quick summary, yeah, last week, the International Energy Agency, which was set up by developed economies essentially to defend the oil industry several decades ago, and has routinely put out annual forecasts projecting that oil growth is just going to continue forever. They released a report last week saying, oh, wait a second, if we're going to reach net zero emissions by 2050 globally, we have to stop expanding fossil fuel production everywhere. And that's not a surprising conclusion. Those of us in the environmental movement reached that conclusion a long time ago. But to hear it from the International Energy Agency was very significant. And hopefully, it's like, cabinet tables, corporate boardrooms are going to hear that message, hopefully. And then, you also mentioned there were a number of things yesterday. So there was, first of all, Shell, which is one of the biggest emitters, one of the biggest global oil companies, based in the Netherlands, was successfully or lost a court case in the Dutch court, and they are now required to reduce their emissions by 45% by 2030 as a company, including, I believe, including downstream emissions. So that's huge. That's going to change entirely how their business operates. There's no way for them to greenwash it around the edges. Like, they are now legally obligated as a company to reduce emissions significantly. And then there were also Chevron and one of the other oil companies had their annual election of board members, and activist investors successfully had essentially climate activists, or as close to climate activists as you get in the world of finance, elected to the boards of these major oil companies to push for change from the inside. So yeah, taken together, this was a big week for, again, kind of the powers that be, these major oil companies and the people that listen to them, to actually start reckoning with the need to transition away from just perpetual growth in fossil fuel production. So it's big. It is something to celebrate. You're right.
Thanks for that, Adrian. Linda, was there anything you wanted to add to that? Oh, you're muted.
Muted.
Just that, as these enormous changes happen, like a few years ago, we couldn't have conceived of the stuff that happened in the past week or so. As these things happen, the public kind of adjusts to the idea, oh yeah, this can be done. Like it starts to gain a kind of plausibility. So, yes, absolutely, these are moments to celebrate. At the same time, is this going to lead to any change, let's say, on the part of the Trudeau government? And I think Hadrian has done great work on the Trudeau government on this and the budget. It's so true. It's, in some ways, what they're doing seems so big, but it's just not enough. And not only is it not enough, but it's the wrong approach. Like, as you were saying, Hadrian, like the idea of relying on the incentives to the industry to be innovative. This is just not actually going to take us where we go.
Sorry, if I can pick up on that, just to provide a really tangible example of what I mean when we talk about how incentivizing the private sector can be counterproductive. So a really good example is our transition out of coal power. So, combusting coal for heat and power is extremely bad for the climate. Coal is a very, very bad energy source. And so replacing it with anything is a reduction in emissions. The problem is we actually want to reduce our emissions to zero. So when you regulate coal and say you need to phase out coal power, or you bring in something like a carbon price, which kind of nudges you in one direction, what the private sector does is not invest in renewable energy. They invest in gas-fired power plants, because combusting natural gas is better than coal. So it looks like a reduction in emissions. But by investing all of this money and all of this energy into, now we have all this gas-fired power in Alberta in particular, that actually makes it harder for us to reach our 2050 targets. So because there's not a long-term central public strategy, we're actually making it harder to reach our long-term targets by just doing the minimum possible we can to reach our 2030 target.
And, it's interesting because, it's that government doesn't really take the climate change thing seriously. I'm struck by the fact that, for instance, during the Second World War, when people, when governments were serious about fighting Nazism, they understood that you can't just rely on the private sector to provide for war mobilization. Not at all. They mandated war mobilization. And furthermore, the Canadian government created 28 crown corporations to deal with the various aspects of mobilizing for war. In other words, when push came to shove, when it was recognized how important it was, they didn't pussy around with relying on the private sector to come through for them. They organized their own corporations, their own crown corporations. And in fact, it was C.D. Howe, who was one of our leading, financial business tycoons, who took over, who was the sort of czar of war mobilization. And it was under him that these 28 corporations were set up, employing more than 200,000 Canadians doing things like, working on developing radar and developing all kinds of things connected with the war. My point is simply, if the Canadian government would recognize that this crisis is just as serious as that crisis was, they wouldn't be wasting time with, the kinds of incentives that Hadrian's talking about, because that only gets us partway there. And as you point out, by incentivizing, gas-fired, that actually puts money into gas-fired, makes it more difficult to get away from that. So it's a question of government not seeing the seriousness of what we're dealing with here. And obviously, the answer is they've got to be forced by public reaction to deal with this as if it really were a crisis, which of course it is.
Indeed. And if folks will remember our event with Seth Klein talking about the Good War, which I think
I was gonna plug Seth's book, but if he already spoke to you, that's great. Yeah, because we
have plugged it multiple times, and it's never wrong to plug it again. I'll put a link in the chat.
He has set that out beautifully in that book. But sorry, go ahead.
Okay. I agree that we're seeing this acceleration, on the groundswell from the movement, but something that you, I think, lay out really blatantly in your book, especially in the first chapter, is how, blatant the corporate collusion is when you talk about BlackRock and the investment advisory committee that the government forms, right? Just how shocking, how upfront they are with their bold-faced lies. So I guess, why are they so confident, and why don't more people know about this?
Oh, well, okay, you're talking specifically about the Canada Infrastructure Bank and how corrupt it is, how it's just a vehicle to channel Canadian public money to all these vested interests.
That's specifically, and also more generally, like, why are we seeing, you write about how much privatization is accelerating. And so just kind of connecting it to that bigger picture.
Yeah, I mean, maybe another way to do this is to talk about the nationalization of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I mean, there's a situation that, of course, is beyond crazy. Like, if this government has any serious desire to deal with the climate crisis, you don't want to triple the capacity of that pipeline to deliver oil from the oil sands. You want to go in the opposite direction. And yet, we can see exactly what happened. Kinder Morgan, that owned that pipeline, was deeply frustrated because they couldn't get the approvals because, Indigenous opposition and environmental opposition. And so they threatened to pull out, and the oil and gas industry did not want that. And to accommodate them, not to advance any kind of broader public interest, but simply to accommodate those fossil fuel industry companies, the Canadian government buys the thing. I mean, to me, this is just turning. I'm arguing about the importance of public ownership and public control. And here is the government. They won't invest in all kinds of things that would actually increase our control over important areas.
Oh, we lost you for a second then.
Sorry?
We lost you for a second.
Oh, sorry. I'm just saying, it just turns the whole idea of public ownership on its head, that we have public ownership of something that is not in the public interest, that is in fact contrary to the public interest, and is just a way of bailing out these private corporate interests. That seems to me so much of what the Trudeau government is all about.
If I could just add a couple things, there's like, we kind of have the wrong people in politics is a lot of it. You look, I think we forget sometimes that, like, politicians are people too, and they want to, like, They want their friends to like them. And I know that's like, sounds like very simplistic and almost naive, but it is fair to say that when you have finance ministers and the only social circles they roll in are Bay Street financial circles, and they are invested themselves in Bay Street and so on, like they're going to make decisions that make them look good there. So I'm not saying that's the whole picture, but they're people too, and that's part of the challenge. Like I think it is our political system doesn't do a good enough job of empowering, especially people from like marginalized groups or just from not that mainstream to actually bring different voices into politics. So that's part of it. I mean, our entire first past the post political system is like a whole other conversation we can have that incentivizes a particular kind of politics that's not interested in the long term. And then the other point I would make, and this is not to defend our government, but international pressure matters, and it has become harder for Canada. It wasn't that Canada alone adopted this neoliberal approach. It was that it was part of this movement, especially in the US and the UK, to privatize and deregulate over the last 30 or 40 years. And because we're so embedded in that international system, it makes it hard for us on our own to go the other way, but not impossible, and it's not worth trying.
You both use international examples in arguing for your proposals. Linda, you talk about Norway and their public ownership and how that's helped them wean off fossil fuels much more quickly than we have. And Hadrian, you use Denmark and New Zealand as examples in your Just Transition report. I was wondering if you could kind of expand on that. What do we learn from these countries? And in what ways are we able to compare ourselves to them? In what ways are we not?
Well, okay. I mean, my example with Norway was to compare Norway versus Alberta because they're roughly similar in size and amount of oil and the time in which they developed oil, and yet they have totally different approaches. You know, the public ownership approach of Norway versus the incredible focus on private ownership in Alberta. And, you know, probably the most striking difference is just how much richer Norway is as a result, because they actually insisted on getting value. You know, they allowed foreign oil companies to operate there, but they taxed them extremely high. And they also had their own public oil company that was extremely profitable. But you're right. In addition to being way more profitable, and by the way, the difference is significant. You know, the Heritage Fund in Alberta is worth about 18 billion. The Heritage Fund in Norway is worth about 1.3 trillion. So we're talking about just a massive difference. But also, as you're saying, Adrian, you know, because of this public ownership and you know, more open to notions of the public interest and pressure from the public, there's been a greater focus on you know, dealing with climate change and dealing, you know, obviously Norway is an oil producing country, and you know, Greenpeace has been extremely critical of Norway. So I don't want to whitewash them, but their record, if you compare their record to Canada's record, it's just night and day. Norway is so far ahead of us. But can I also just pick up on, you know, we're talking about the importance of these sort of international changes and the international leadership and what's going on with that. I guess I just find it striking that, you know, as Hadrian was saying, of course, other countries have, you know, have also embraced Reaganomics and neoliberalism, etc. But we're kind of at a very interesting moment in a lot of ways right now, in that the Biden administration in the US is, you know, for the first time in decades, we have an administration in the US that is pushing for some serious changes in the neoliberal agenda, you know, serious taxation of the rich, Also, they recently backed a proposal at the World Trade Organization to support the developing world in demanding, patents for pharmaceuticals be waived in terms of the COVID vaccine. I mean, I don't want to overstate the changes, but these are openings that haven't been there before, and the Canadian government is not picking up on those openings. In terms of some of the key changes that Biden is proposing about taxing the rich, he wants to go after the tax havens, and he has a very interesting proposal for a global corporate minimum tax. He needs to get other countries on side. Germany and France have already joined in and given support. Canada hasn't. This is a tremendous opportunity for us to be pushing in the direction of progressive change. Instead, we're sitting on the sidelines. We're less progressive than the United States. This is crazy.
Yeah, if I could pick up on that, there's a real irony here, because often our kind of commitment to the status quo of our very unequal, exploitative, fossil fuel-based economy is framed in terms of, well, it's actually in our best interest. We're protecting our own jobs. We're protecting our own economy. And the real irony is that we're actually not. We're falling behind as countries around the world. We mentioned some of them, and I agree with Linda. We don't want to pretend like any country has done this perfectly, but it is absolutely true that there are countries around the world further ahead than us. So I highlight Denmark and New Zealand because those are two countries saying, "Oh, we're just going to stop developing oil. There's no way that's part of our future economy. Moratorium. Now let's figure out the transition." And that's significant because that's just not an acknowledgement we've made in Canada. We did with coal because that was easy. We haven't done it with oil and gas. We need to make it quite clear, even if it's going to take us some time to transition, and we can debate how long that should take. We have not been clear that oil is not going to be part of our economy in any meaningful way in 20 or 30 years. So that's the big thing we're behind on. And just, to reiterate that we are putting ourselves at a huge disadvantage economically speaking by not embracing this transition. And this is quite evident, to use one example, in electric vehicles. So Canada is a big vehicle auto manufacturer, but our producers have been very hesitant to get on the electric vehicle train, because the train, to mix metaphors here, because we're going to lose money by moving first. We're not going to invest in that kind of stuff. We're just going to build the cars we know how to make. And now all of a sudden with Biden, there's this massive push to turn over the entire U.S. auto sector. And we're going to get left behind, and we're going to end up losing those jobs anyway. Just like we're going to lose all those jobs in oil and gas. Better to actually manage the transition than to just be left to ultimately what our global market force is.
Thank you both. So I want to go to the Q&A now. We have 20 minutes left of discussion. This one comes from Paula Halpin, and it's for you, Hadrian. What would need to change to have the public sector lead a just transition away from fossil fuel production and consumption?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That's a great question. I'm going to put it to Linda in a second. I would say at a policy level, we kind of know what to do. And a lot of it comes down to either nationalization or the creation of things like crown corporations that can actually take control. And it is a very ironic example that the Trans Mountain Pipeline is a great example of nationalizing an essential project. Unfortunately, we just nationalized the wrong one. But we clearly have the capacity to do it as a federal government, and provinces could do it too. A big part of making this more viable is we actually need to start addressing the revenue question. So we're afraid in our political climate to talk about taxes, to talk about revenues. But for the public sector to be effective, it needs to have the resources to do so. And the good news is we can actually do that without raising taxes significantly on most people. There are proposals out there now for things like a wealth tax, financial transactions tax. There are lots of good ways we could raise government revenue in a way that was equitable. But what I am still trying to figure out and struggle with, and maybe Linda has more insight on, is how do we change politically? Like how do we shift the political culture in Canada to embrace these kinds of solutions?
Oh, you're tossing that at me.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, that is the key question, because the only way we're going to do this is by public pressure. And somehow we have to change that political culture so that, there's Trudeau, terribly concerned about his image as a progressive. That's his key to success, because he's holding off the forces of Aaron O'Toole, and he manages to attract all kinds of support that would otherwise go to more progressive parties, because he seems to be progressive but also sort of sellable to people. We have to somehow get beyond that. We have to somehow convince the public that his solution, that the solution of having the private sector always be the one that will sort of figure out how we're going to deal with these crises, that's crazy. That is not going to work. We have to somehow create a change in the culture. I do think it helps tremendously when we have these important changes in the international field, the kinds of developments that are now starting to happen. If we had like 20 years, I think we could do it. The question is, can we do it faster? I do believe that the answer lies in that kind of political pressure. And it's interesting, Hadrian, you make the point about politicians, and they're like people, and it's they are people. It's absolutely true that they come from Bay Street often, or the corporate world, and in terms of the people they deal with, the kinds of solutions they're coming up with appeal to those people, so they're getting all kinds of positive reinforcement. Now, clearly the answer's got to be that we have people from other segments as well. But it strikes me that if the public had a sense of how badly, how the government was not, was maybe pleasing its friends, not dealing with the broader public interest, there would be more anger. We have to get there. You were also saying the same point about good people. You're making the point there's lots of good people in corporations as well. There's no point in assuming that they all have bad, that they don't care about climate change or whatever. The problem is that the whole structure of the corporate world is simply designed to not allow whatever good motives they have to be properly expressed or to be properly put in place. The design of the corporate world, it's designed so that the public interest is completely irrelevant. The corporation is designed simply, to deliver profits to shareholders. And I'm not saying that as criticism. That's what corporations are designed to do, and that's all that they're designed to do. So this whole notion that, corporate responsibility, we can sort of get them to do good things. Well, there's lots of good people in those companies, but as long as they're in the corporate structure, that they won't be able to put those good intentions to any kind of significant, in any, to significant progress.
Yeah. And I want to get to some more questions, but Linda, I'm finding myself wanting to put in a plug for the Breach Media, just because we keep talking about the journalism and the culture shift that needs to happen, right? And media is incredibly corporate, and that's part of it. I'm just going to link it. Anybody can go if they want. So both Linda McQuaig and Martin Lukács are writers and contributors to the Breach, which is a new independent journalism project, which I'm really enjoying.
Martin had a great piece in the opening day about the pension funds and how they were supporting water privatization down in Brazil. Terrific piece.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that, and his investigative piece about the conversations happening behind closed doors during the from the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So Helen Reardon is asking an infrastructure question, I think to either of you. What do you think about the government putting solar panels on everybody's house and apartments, which are south and west facing? If it was done on a big scale, do you think that would reduce emissions? So I might also invite you to kind of talk about some of the calls that you make more broadly in your proposals also.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. And, we need to make every effort, both socially and for those of us who own homes to do our part in reducing emissions. Efficiency is part of that. And there is a new government program that actually launched today to provide grants for home retrofits that would include things like solar panels. We just have to not fall into the trap of thinking that climate change is a problem that we can solve just as individual consumers. Too often it's framed as like, reduce your carbon footprint and we solve the problem. And the best evidence for why that isn't the case is look at what happened in the past year with the pandemic. People stopped commuting, people stopped flying around the world, people just stayed in their homes and emissions didn't go down. And that's because emissions, as much as we do contribute from as individuals, it's like fossil fuel production alone, just getting oil out of the ground in Canada accounts for 25% of our emissions. And then once you burn it, it's even more. So we really the important thing, especially that governments need to be dealing with, is these big picture issues of reducing emissions. So yes, absolutely. If you can afford it and it's viable in your community to invest in energy efficiency and renewable energy in your home, that's great. And we should be encouraging that. But in and of itself, it's not the solution.
Linda?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that. There's often an attempt to make people feel guilty that they're not doing enough about the environment, and I've seen people argue that the public doesn't care about climate change because you can see they're still driving cars. That is such a wrong argument. What we need is leadership. If the forces in power, if governments would actually take a leadership role and create through various means, create the conditions for the green economy, people would be inspired by that. People would follow that. To expect people on their own to, stop driving cars and to, stop taking flights, it's people get a sense that that's just a drop in the bucket. But if you give them some kind of structure that they are a key part of, but it's not just them, it's the whole system. I think it makes a huge difference. I mean, one just little example, I find something like recycling. Recycling has become like recycling garbage, but that has become something that, at least in Toronto, I find people take very seriously. People actually separate their garbage, and they're very keen to cooperate with that. But it's because it's not just them doing it in their own, to help out. It's part of a broader system, and they can see that if they go along with this, that it will make a tremendous difference. Now, there's problems that I don't think the recycling is as good as it should be at the actual level of the recycling. But my point is that people seem very willing to cooperate when there's some leadership. And it strikes me that if the government would take much more of a leadership role and stop relying, as Hadrian says, on your own personal responsibility to reduce your carbon footprint, I think they'd find a tremendous cooperation.
Yeah, if I could just say again, because I see there's a comment in the chat that it's quite right. Cars definitely are a big part of the problem. And I don't want to downplay the fact that if you as an individual can make environmentally friendly choices, that's good and important, and you should do that. But we need to recognize that, yeah, it's not that, like Linda said, it's not that people are driving internal combustion engine cars just because they hate electric vehicles. It's like they live in cities that are designed for cars. They're required to drive them to get their essential needs. And the only cars that they can have access to and can afford are gas cars. So yes, it's good to encourage, some personal responsibility, but to actually solve these problems, we need collective action.
That actually is a great transition into, I think we have time for maybe 2, maybe 3 more questions. Just quickly, Helen Reardon's follow-up question, which is, do you think we should all go out to BC and protest the clear cutting and cutting of old growth forests? I feel like joining them. Do you think that is effective? I could even get arrested, as I am retired now and my kids are grown. I say yes.
Yeah. It just seems absolutely vulgar and repulsive to me to see those great big huge trees carted off on trucks. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say, as just a general point, like, if you're the kind of person who's comfortable like putting your body on a line and getting arrested, like, fantastic. We need those people. That, like, absolutely is essential, and like there's so much work done by land defenders that is underappreciated. At the same time, if you're not comfortable doing that, like, contribute in your own way. There's lots of ways to advocate and make a difference. So yeah, do what you can do.
Well said. Then, just to speak up on behalf of the coalition, the Green New Deal perspective is collective action is what will save us, right? And so find other people who feel like you do and organize with them. Organize with us. You're welcome to join us. Go in your workplace, organize your workplace and strike. Do whatever, is wherever you have leverage in society, that's where you want to focus. And the other thing that we like to talk about a lot, and we're going to talk about this at the end of the event, is if you have the means, one of the most effective things you can put your money to is supporting frontline resistance. So each month we focus on a different frontline group. Right now, we are trying to support 1492 Land Back Lane and their legal defense fund, because the OPP is harassing them and sticking them with massive fees. The next question comes from Nora Fraser, who asks, does owning the pipeline make it easier to shut it down if a new government wants to do that?
Yes, the short answer is yes. And in fact, that was one of the big criticisms from conservatives when Trudeau bought that pipeline, is they're like, oh, he's just buying it so he can shut it down. I don't think he did. I think he bought it because he really wanted to build it. But it is true. Now that it is the property of the people of Canada, absolutely, government could just end that project anytime it wants. The sad part is, like, at such great cost. We've already invested. It was the sticker price was $4.5 billion. We committed to $10 billion in construction costs. If we shut that project down, all that money's gone. It's going to be gone anyway. At this point, we need to cut our losses and just say that project's not going to happen.
Linda?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's true that we could shut it down. We own it. We have the power to shut it down. Of course, we could have, effectively shut it down just by using regulatory mechanisms. So the idea that we spent, that we went 12 billion into debt, and of course, there's absolutely no sign the Trudeau government has any intention of shutting it down. This is a very roundabout way. If that's what the plan is, it's a very roundabout way to achieve it. Why not just, well, first of all, why not take that 12 billion and invest it in something like developing electric cars in Canada, rather than something that takes us farther down the path of fossil fuels. But also, why not use the power of government to cut off subsidies to fossil fuels, or to just, come out against that pipeline and do whatever we can through the whole environmental review process. The government has consistently been on the wrong side. So I just think that yes, technically we could cut it down, could shut it down. That's a very expensive way to do what could have been done much easier.
Thank you. Final question before I'll invite you to make any closing remarks, touch on anything that you feel we've missed. Is a really big picture from Ilse Turnsen. Are we not facing the frustrating problem of not facing the crisis? And I don't know if she's referring to civil society or to government, but just kind of not acknowledging this moment that we're in.
Yeah, I think there's, I mean, Linda mentioned this earlier, that like the real issue, especially in the climate context, is just time. There is a possibility that if we were not in a rush, we could just maintain this sort of incremental sort of status quo approach of slowly kind of bending towards a more progressive economy. That wouldn't resolve all of the inequities in our current economy, but we maybe could address the climate crisis. But that's just not the case. Like, we are on a timeline. We've already missed a lot of deadlines, both political and geological, and we just can't wait for market efficiency to take its course. So yeah, it's a crisis, and it's yet to be reflected in certainly public policy, even though more and more politicians are talking about crisis, and we did have a climate crisis motion in the House of Commons and so on. It's not reflected in policy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there certainly are policy developments that show government is, doing some things in the direction of dealing with the climate crisis that it wasn't doing 10, 15 years ago. I mean, the attitude on the part of politicians and political, and for that matter, people inside government and the bureaucracy, I think there has been a fundamental change. But there's kind of a sense that, we're dealing with it. We're finally on track, and we're finally doing something about it. Look at the big money that we're throwing at it, with the federal budget, that kind of thing. What seems to be lacking is a sense of crisis. They can call it a crisis in their, when they put a bill forward, but they don't act like it's a crisis. And I guess, part of the problem is, the media doesn't treat it as a crisis. The media treats it as, well, the climate is an important issue, and, political parties have to show they're serious about it. Canadians want action, but they don't, they don't treat it like it's you see the Globe and Mail has changed its position quite a bit. They now sort of recognize that things have to be done, that we have to seriously take measures to reduce the crisis. But there's not a sense. We are in a very different place than, let's say, during a war, when people just think, nobody said during the Second World War, well, can we afford to fight Hitler? They just thought it was an existential threat. They had to fight Hitler, and they threw at it everything they had. Somehow that sense of crisis is lacking, and that's what we've got to create.
Adrian?
No, I don't have, I think, too much more to add. It is absolutely a crisis. I mean, I think everyone on this call probably shares that feeling and shares that frustration. We just have to keep fighting for it. It won't happen without that.
Okay, that seems like a good note to end on. So we're going to transition to Chris McLean's musical performance, and then I'll have some closing housekeeping notes. Charles-Antoine, when you're ready with. Thank you.
dance in the wind. Sorrow, way up there, once a paradise, ancient eyes look lost beneath the flashing neon lights. Take this prayer, the heart of the seed. One day soon you will be free. Write a letter, carry a sign, do what we can. There's still time. Way up there, trees are mowed like grass. Trucks steal away with the treasure, but the questions are not asked. Way in here, I recognize your face. I know the sound of your voice across the deepest space. Only what we need. Slow it down, start to breathe. Listen to the wind in the trees. There will be a way. There will be a way. The lotus blooms, beauty born from mud will flower. Front hands pointing to the light. When love has all the power, take this prayer, the heart of the seed. One day soon you will be free. Write a letter, carry a sign, do what we can. There's still time. There's still time. There's still time.
Thank you so much, Chris. Chris is also local to Wakefield, Quebec. She's played with many styles, many ensembles, played and trained and toured in many countries. She leads the Song Kitchen Choir in Wakefield, Ottawa. Her third CD, Procrastinator, is out now, and I will also link her page. There we go. There's still time. There will be a way. That was beautiful. So I guess it comes to me to thank everybody and share a lot of links. So first of all, thank you so much to our amazing panelists, Adrian, Linda. That was a fantastic, really good discussion. I really took a lot from it. I hope everybody else did too. Adrian, good luck with the newborn who is on their way. That's so beautiful. And we're really excited for you for that. Linda, good luck with the rest of the book tour. I'm going to put the link for Dundurn right there in the chat for anybody who wants to read it. I found it so informative. It talks about the banks and the railroads and Alberta and the hydro. There's so much there that I didn't know anything about that you probably won't get anywhere else. So I recommend it. What else? If you want to get involved with us, send us an email. We'll be onboarding people when we come back next summer. If you want to give us money, we have a link for that too, for future education events. We run mostly off donations and municipal grants, so that's super welcome. And like I said, if you want to support 1492 Land Back Lane with their legal fees, they've got a lot of legal fees. So this link, they're getting close to one of their goals. So that's great. Thank you to my co-organizers. Charles-Antoine has done the back end, and Ilsa and Noel coordinated with Don and Chris. So there's a whole team of us, and we hope to do really exciting things when we come back next summer. And tune in next month for the Circular Economy webinar. Thank you both. Charles-Antoine, Councillor Fillon. Bye tout le monde.
Merci, bonsoir tout le monde. Thanks a lot, Yuba. Thanks, Adrian.
Yeah, thanks. That was great.
It was.
Linda, you're muted.
Yeah, no, thanks. A very interesting conversation.
And well hosted, Adrian. Well done.